Welcome back, everyone. This is the 20th installment of One Week Critique's interview series. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, an editor for One Week Critique, and this is Manuel Muñoz. Manuel Muñoz is the author of a novel, What You See in the Dark, and the short story collections Zyzzyva and The Faith Healer of Olive Avenue, which was shortlisted for the Frank O'Connor Award. He's the recipient of fellowships from the NEA and the New York Foundation for the Arts. He's been recognized with a Whiting Award, 3 O. Henry Awards, and an appearance in the Best American Short Stories. A native of Dinuba, California, and a first-generation college student, Manuel graduated from Harvard and Cornell universities. He currently lives and works in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, Manuel.
Hi, Ingrid. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us. So today we'll be looking at 2 versions of your short story, Anyone Can Do It. An early draft called It's All True, as well as the final published version of the story that appears in Zyzzyva and the Best American Short Stories 2019. Would you read us the first page of your early draft, Manuel?
It's all true. The green car had come to take him just before noon, and she had to wait with the snooze, her mother said, until the Fina got in from the field. Just one car, her mother said, and it had come straight to the house, the officer knocking on the front door and asking for the Mexican boy by name. She could not have lied to the officer, not with the little ones crowding at her knees, and the Mexican boy wouldn't have known where to run anyway. Delfina heard this news in the early evening, after a long day in the heat of the peach orchards. The July weather had held just hot enough to keep the fruit coming, but not so brutal that the work couldn't keep going from sunup to sundown. She heard this news even before she entered the house, her mother reporting to her from the steps, as if she couldn't wait to tell her.
Wonderful, Manuel. Thank you. Now, in the emails we traded leading up to this conversation, you noted about your early draft that it was written in winter 2017, that you paused that spring and then started almost anew in the summer. What was it that made you start over again? Do you think the pause you took helped you find the story you most wanted to tell that sort of best fit your particular vision?
Yeah, I mean, I was under this moment of, I've been struggling with stories for a long time. So the deal that I had with my agent, who's been my primary reader, is to show my pages every 2 weeks, maybe, with no commentary, but just for accountability's sake. And that really got me going with some stories, but it also gave me sometimes a chance to go back and really look at what I was sending and asking, do I even know what the story's about? And very often I was doubtful. And this one proved to be, at least the way that I was starting it, didn't seem like it was going anywhere. All I knew was that someone had been taken away by immigration, he'd been deported, but I didn't know anything about what to do with the characters. So I started over. So that's really what happened. I hit a wall, and then I just decided, look, you've got some building blocks. Come back to the building blocks and see what you can do with them. So and I can get into some of the intricacies maybe of what I thought were building blocks, but what I noticed just in reading back those first 2 paragraphs was I could see myself already starting to build in an urgency with the story that wasn't there. Someone's telling somebody a story, and someone is curious about why the story is being told. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, to that end, I noticed that certain lines are repeated across drafts, but in entirely different contexts. I'm wondering, how did your early draft help you toward your final version? And do you think some of the lines that you kept sort of lighted the way?
I think so, because, you know, as hard as I was being on the draft itself. I always remind myself that if I have cleared the hurdle of the mystery of my own head, whatever's been bubbling up in there that had demanded that it get on the page in the first place is worth investigating, is worth drafting, is worth shaping. But I just had to sort of relearn a patience with myself about just the faith in the bones of the story. So it was helpful sometimes for me to print out the pages. I would reread them, annotate them, and if there were images or moments of interaction between characters that I thought were valuable, I let that percolate. And sometimes even within a draft, I would maybe just take the same image and just plop it in again deliberately, and just try to rework it into a new context. And I think that's how maybe, for example, there's a soda pop bottle with that's popped on the spigot, and that's just an image I remember from being a kid of, you know, watching one of the older men in my family, you know, do that and being mystified by it. And I knew that it was going to pop in the story somehow. I just didn't know where. But they start to serve as anchor points for me to start hinging other images or scenes and build outward in a way that I think is unexpected for me. I think that's about the answer for that so far. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so fascinating. I think especially what you have to say about annotating and kind of coming back to those images. I've never worked that way myself, so I find that really interesting. So for the benefit of viewers who haven't yet read Anyone Can Do It, would you summarize that story for us, the final story you ended up with?
Oh, well, the story became, well, as it always was. It was a story of a woman whose husband has been deported, and she doesn't know what to do next. And she realizes that she's powerless to do anything about his situation, but the situation at home is the rent's due. So while the worry about how to get him back is something that she'll have to think about, she's got to take care of the now. And that's where that line came from in the final draft. Her immediate concern was money. And that was my pause to come back and say, who is this character? What is the conflict? What is it that they really want? All of those basic story questions that we sometimes feel really silly for asking, you know, students in the workshop, you know, to come back to those basics, but they're incredibly helpful. They were very helpful for me in this draft. But that's what it became. Here's a woman who's facing with this situation. How is she going to pay for this? And how is she going to get this money? Before she has a chance to really answer that question, a neighbor comes over essentially with the same dilemma, says, I have an idea. You know, your car is here. Why don't the two of us go out to the orchards? I know where the men always go every morning to work. Let's do the work ourselves, see how much we can get paid and work from there. She hesitates for a moment, decides to think about it, then decides, yes, so I'll do this. And there's a certain amount of pride in the fact that she's able to do this. But in the middle of the orchard at lunchtime, the other woman unexpectedly goes back to retrieve their lunch from the car and takes the car. And so the protagonist comes back to the foreman who's giving them the work, and realizes what's happened. And now she's got a whole other new dilemma to really think about. And the farmer gives her some money as a kind of apology for assuming the best. I believed the other woman when she said that you were sisters. So that's the story.
Wonderful.
And there are other elements in there, obviously. I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
the kid, and so forth. So, yeah, but that's the gist of the story.
I think what you have to say about the first line is really compelling too, in that it made me think a little bit of this anecdote in James Wood's book, How Fiction Works. He talks about Conrad and I think Ford Madox Ford trading letters and trying to discuss the kinds of lines that get characters in right away. And for me, it's such a simple line, but I feel like I'm immediately in this character's head. So I see what you're saying about going back to the basics and the silliness of that, but the importance of it too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, though, that was beautifully summarized. Would you mind reading us the first page of that new draft now?
Well, sure. Anyone can do it. Her immediate concern was money. It was a Friday when the men didn't come home from the fields. And true, sometimes the men wouldn't return until late. The headlights of the neighborhood work truck turning the corner, the men drunk and laughing from the bed of the pickup. And true, other women might have thought first about the green immigration vans prowling the fields and the orchards all around the valley, ready to take away the men they might not see again for days if good luck held, or even longer if they found no luck at all. When the street fell silent at dusk, the screen doors of the dark houses opened one by one, and the shadows of the women came to sit out on the concrete steps. Delfina was one of them, but her worry was a different sort. She didn't know these women yet, and these women didn't know her. She and her husband and her little boy had been in the neighborhood for only a month, renting a 2-room house at the end of the street, with a narrow screened-in back porch, a tight bathroom with no insulation, and a mildewed kitchen. There was only a dirt yard for the boy to play in, and they had to drive into the town center to use the payphone to call back to Texas, where Delfina was from. They had been here just long enough for Delfina's husband to be welcomed along to the fieldwork, the pay split among all the neighborhood men, the work truck chugging away from the street before the sun even rose.
Wonderful, Manuel. Thank you again for reading to us in your raspy voice.
Yeah.
So in the early version of this story, you include more detail about why men doing field work might not come back. You're more specific about apprehension and what that might look like for these workers. I wonder if that change, cutting back some of that detail, has to do with finding Delfina's position in the story, sort of getting past what you know about apprehension yourself, what readers may not know, and letting the language Delfina would have access to and the story's action do more of the talking. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, it does, because it's, I even reading it back, having just read the other portion, I'm thrilled with the difference, if I can say so myself.
Yeah.
Why? Because I realized in that draft, the world is immediate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what I've always struggled with in depicting the place that I come from, the Central Valley of California, is the familiarity I have with it. I forget that people don't know it. Or sometimes I think if they've read other stories of mine, if they've seen me describe an orchard or, this neighborhood, they've seen it before. And I forget that each of us has to start with a blank slate. We're going to be new to someone.
Mm-hmm.
So how we create that world has to have as much openness and flexibility as as a story can manage. And that's what I discovered, just comparing those two.
Mm-hmm.
what are the discoveries that I saw there? Time, for example, that detail about the fact that they had essentially just moved to that neighborhood, and she has no connection to anybody around them. But on the other hand, the world will always assume that because they're all from the same neighborhood, they're the same. And that complexity is not something I would ever have been able to achieve on one draft or the first couple of scribblings. It really took me meditating on, well, what's the neighborhood and how did they get there, and how committed is she to staying, and so on and so forth. Again, all of those basic questions that allowed me to deepen character and then give myself a springboard for the motivation. There was another change I noticed too between the two, that's also similar. In the first one, she's listening to a story, so there's still a passivity. This one is too, but she's on equal footing with everyone. It's like we're all coming out of the houses at the same time. And there's a wariness that she has with the shadows on either side. And I'm really glad that I took the time to like really come back and understand that, so that I could shape the final draft as it came out. Yeah.
That makes sense. And, you know, I was worried that question was a little confusing or leading, so I'm glad that it makes sense, and that maybe I was onto a little something there. So I come back again and again a little obsessively to this introduction Tobias Wolff wrote for an anthology that he also edited. It's an old anthology, one I had in college, called The Vintage Book of Contemporary American Short Stories. I come back to it because of what Tobias Wolff has to say broadly about realism and what can work about it. He claims that a sense of kinship is what makes stories important to us. I'm quoting him here. We need to feel ourselves acted upon by a story, outraged, exposed, in danger of heartbreak and change. Those are the stories that endure in our memories, to the point where they take on the nature of memory itself. In this way, the experience of something read can form us no less than the experience of something lived through. For me, anything can do it, and many of your other stories work in just this way. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how you relate to your main character, Delphina. Do you sometimes feel like you've come so close to this story, these days of Delphina's life, that you've lived through them yourself? That you've sort of been Delphina in this kind of like method actor sort of way? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I don't remember if I said this in the Best American, about the story section, or I might have said it about another work, but my father had a stroke about 5 years ago.
Sorry.
And I helped my mother take care of him. And during his rehab time, I started hearing him tell a lot of stories that I had never heard before. And it was a new phase of parent-child relationship. One, questioning why if the stories that my dad were telling were even true, because there were a couple of instances where my mom said that never happened, or he's got it wrong was another thing.
Yeah.
But what came out of it, I was in the middle of this manuscript, and it helped me shape the stories that were to come. Meaning, I had a new respect for how I grew up and the experiences I had being in a farm working family, having the experience of that work myself, but being shielded from the hardest of it. But the new dimension was talking to my parents about those years. I mean, he must have been deported. I can remember at least 4 times that I remember as a child, and it must have happened more than that. But the way that I was remembering it was always my experience. How did I feel with my dad being gone? As opposed to what was my mom going through? How did she manage to, and she loves to brag about this. You know, she said, you know, no cell phone, no credit card, no cash. But I made it to the Mexican border and brought your dad back every time.
Oh.
And those stories are incredible to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I think about characters like Delfina, every aspect of what I think I know, I don't really know until I sit down and describe it anew. I mean, to really be worried about money to that extent, when you are relying on your partner for financial stability, the hard work of trusting somebody to split proceeds with you when you're going in on work together. Like all of those sort of fears and terrors, and I think that's, and it's true. I think of several of the stories. There's a new kind of respect that I had for the characters that were sort of willing themselves on the page, and you know, when the characters submit to like what literature wants to do to them, it's like, yeah, they can withstand all of those really tough questions, craft questions. Absolutely. If anything, it'll only deepen the story.
Yeah, no, I mean, you try on so many different characters from similar places with similar backgrounds sometimes, but I mean, there really is such a range across your work in terms of the kinds of characters you tackle. And I mean, I think sometimes you're dealing with in difficult situations. You know, I think this one comes up in Zigzagger, but one where a father is asking his son for money.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I mean, I think you bravely take those characters through situations where, you know, their pride is suffering, but they're also sometimes having very negative or difficult thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
ones that might be very different from your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'd add that I remember a comment that someone made in a grad workshop, you know, when we always hear the very painful comments. And someone said something to the effect of, you know, why are your characters so noble all the time? Which I don't think I understood at the time. I took it as a critique, but didn't really understand where it was coming from. But it lodged in my head. And later, when I was able to take that comment and actually make something of it, and not that I'm saying I think this is what the person was trying to tell me, is what did I turn it into?
Sure.
It was allow your characters to have conflicted emotions. It's okay for them to be angry, or to do heinous things, or be uncharitable to somebody. I think that's one of the reasons why the title change resonated so much for me, because it's a line in the story in which, you know, Lisa's talking about field work. You know, it's like, well, anyone can do this work, just you don't want to. But it also refers to, you know, her act of stealing the car is also within that particular realm. You know, what kinds of things might drive any of us to do such a thing? And I liked having that possibility of a title resonating in lots of different kinds of areas. So that's one of the reasons why, even as, you know, to the title work, you know, thinking about all of these questions is very helpful.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you about the title. I think it's a meaty one, and I mean, it's one that pushes you to, as a reader, encounter Liz, who, I mean, is not the main character is a major character in the story, but one that you aren't asked to empathize with in the same way. And yeah, I mean, on my first read, I was very surprised by what she did, because I mean, she seemed very harmless in so many ways. And looking back, I couldn't believe I hadn't seen all the signs of this coming.
Yeah.
But I also very much felt as a reader like I don't know her story and why she did this, and maybe it could be me, maybe it could be Delphina who does this. Like, we don't know her level of desperation and what her plan was, and when this came up for her. And I
Yeah.
think you're so right. The title takes you there.
Yeah, and you know, for writers, short story writers, I can't speak for everybody, but I like having cross currents of characters. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes a very minor character will pop up in something else. But another thing I've been trying is kind of mirrors of each other. There's another story that came out in Glimmer Train about 7 years ago called The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA. And I sort of see them as mirror stories, because it's in that story, someone goes out of their way to help somebody in need. And it was only when I was working on this story, I thought of that one, and I thought, you set yourself up for this to be possible. You know, you've shown, you know, good sides. You can show a bad one. It's okay. And I left room for surprise.
So my next question for you is this. Milan Kundera prefers to think not so much about influence as about what he terms aesthetic houses. He claims he doesn't live under the same roof as Hemingway, much as he admires Hemingway's work. He sees himself as existing with Musil, Braque, Kafka, because his work is connected with theirs, because they're all in conversation with each other. I think this is a nifty idea, and I just wondered, whose roof do you think you share? What work is your work in conversation with?
Oh, I always struggle with this question because, okay, my answer to that is, I have three names come to mind. Elena Maria Viramontes, my mentor. And that's, I think, an obvious answer for a lot of people, or people who know my work.
Sure.
Steinbeck, I think, is also more important than I realize. But the writer who I just admire so deeply, and who is very inspirational to me as well, is Edward P. Jones. And so much of it just has to do with the fact that, you know, how, you know, he amplifies DC, you know, you know, that's his region, that's the place, that's how, you know, what the characters know about the intricacies of the place, the history of the place, how they live their lives there, their wishes, their dreams, everything is there. And, you know, it's so far removed from my vision of the Central Valley, but he has such respect and evident love for the place. And it shows in his stories, and it shows in the characters that he places, you know, in these situations. So I would love to be able to say, you know, my work's in conversation, but it's such a, I don't know why I take it as such a loaded question. It feels so, I don't know what the word is. I get a little shy about it.
You know, that makes sense to me. I think part of why I'm drawn to this aesthetic house idea is, I think, relative to influence, it feels less like, you know, you're taking something and more like you're just living and sharing a little bit. And I mean, I know when I think about it and think about writers that I would put myself under the same roof of, like, I'm like, oh God, do I deserve to be under that roof?
Yeah.
You know, it feels immodest, but I mean, I think you're in conversation with who you're in conversation with. You're reading who you're reading.
Yeah.
It's fascinating one, and I'm curious to read more of Jones's work here.
Yeah.
So moving along, I've noticed in reading some of your other books that you pay special attention to color. I'm thinking of the plain silver buckle in Zyzzyva, the white dresses and their sudden orange poppies. I'm also thinking of the spot on the Egyptian cotton in Faith Healer, the brown shirt with the orange on its sides. These images really stick with me. I think as a reader, I'm really drawn to color. So I don't know if this is just my lens, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of color in Anyone Can Do It, because I see it as prominent.
Yeah. This might come, and I'm just sort of guessing here, but guessing about my own work, but Almodovar, going to the film director, Pedro Almodovar, even as I'm watching his films, I'm sometimes amazed by how my eye will drift to the backdrop, some intriguing wallpaper, or the way, the place is appointed, some office or some bedroom or someone's living room or something. That makes me wonder why more directors don't do that. There's always some kind of color popping somewhere or some interesting pattern. And I think I gravitate toward that because it reminds me once again, try not to clutter and keep things as simple as possible. So when something notable does need to be described, give it the simplest color you can, the simplest pattern. And I mean, I'm still, I was so taken with the white dress with the orange poppies on it that it actually popped up in another story, because it's a small town with the same fabric shop, and it'll come up again. And I'm hoping that it'll be sort of like a little Easter egg for anyone who's really paying attention. But those little details thrill me because they serve as reminders that I've got to pay attention to the smallest things. This is a world in which most people are ignored. So anything within the greater fabric of the story that reminds us, look at the smallest, look at the meekest. There's going to be something worth noticing. I think that's at the core of why I do that.
That's interesting. I knew about you that you're a little bit of a cinephile, and it makes sense that in responding to those visuals, they'd find their way into your work. So getting a little closer to the text, one of my favorite lines in Anyone Can Do It comes when Delfina is standing in the front yard in the shadows. She's talking with Liz, the neighbor. Liz describes the old man who had been living in Delfina's house before she and her husband and their little boy moved in. How he wished he could go back to Mexico because he was all alone. What a terrible thing it is to be alone. And then comes this line, it's in reported or indirect speech. If she knew this woman better, if this woman knew her better, Delfina thought, she would tell her that this was only half true, that it was hard to make a go of it alone, but that it could be just as hard to live in a house without kindness. What a remarkable line that is. I find that Delfina's husband's absence threads its way through the story. It's always there and sort of felt, but she is, as you say, like very much dealing with the now through that. I think it's this line and just a few others that tells me so much, like the whole world about Delfina's husband and how she feels. One reason I like that line so much, I really have a lot of reasons for liking it, is it shows me the control you have as a writer, that you're preparing early for the kindness the foreman is going to show Delfina. So many of the details in this story in just that way feel inevitable, like they're coming up for a reason, like they're all pointing to something. But what on first read is the question you're feeling it. But so I wondered if you could speak to how inevitability works in this story. How do you go about balancing your own knowingness of what's going to happen as the writer with Delfina's sort of unknowingness about, you know, what's going to happen to her that day, unfortunately?
Right. It's a wonderful question because it gives me a chance to talk about a word that I remember hearing, I mean, all through workshop, that I don't think I ever understood when I was first starting out: inevitable. It's a favorite word of Elena's. And you know, she's often reminded me that, you know, the best work will give you that quality. Everything has lined up so that it must end in the way that it does. And I can't say that I was being overly deliberate about the kindness, but again, it comes from the drafting. When I think about what the foreman does in the form of the money, it's a small act, and it might be that readers will respond to that act. But are there other ways, I kept asking myself, for that act to be underlined by something else in the story? And that's why I love the way that you phrase that question. It sets us up. Her lack of kindness here makes this act of kindness even, it's magnified. Did I plan it that way? No. But going back to sort of that basic groundwork of, you know, writing notes to myself of characters and who's here, who's not here. The thing I realized about her husband was that sometimes, if in the early draft I was assuming, of course she wants him back, but it never occurred to me as, well, what kind of man is he? I mean, he could be, you know, just a really mean drunk for all I know. And yet, is that going to be the story, that she's going to work something to make sure that he comes back? So, you know, when it comes back to that moment of talking to Lise and talking about the neighbor, I kind of remember that construction. It's like, well, if I knew you better, I'd be a little more vulnerable, and I tell you a little bit more about who I am, and you know, what you might be assuming about me, just because both of us have partners who've been deported. We're not the same. And I really liked, again, how that helped me open up the possibility. And it's also that line became so instructive to me, that it's that old man is an old man that shows up in a story called Susto. Just to give you another one. I mean, because I was so intrigued. Who lived in that house before they did? And it's that old man. And he shows up as a ghost in another story. So.
I think well put. You know, hard to plan all of this as a writer, to plan how one moment's going to connect to another, especially as you're drafting. But you know, it makes sense that you would start to find those threads through revision over time, and there's so many of them. You know, that was a favorite example of mine, but I could go through and connect all the dots so many times.
Well, just going back to the first question that you asked me, how did I move from that early spring draft to the summer? I usually do about 4 or 5 drafts of a story. And it often means really rewriting it. Just start a new file, and I might have said this to you before in class, where I might print it out, but I start a new file and I try to retell the story without looking at my pages to see what gets picked up. I stopped doing that by like 3rd or 4th draft because some things have lodged. But there's something very intriguing for me that happens when I have to try to piece it all together. And the lines that have really sung to me, I'll remember them, and I'll try to match them as well as I can. And
Mm.
oh no, that's an anchor. That's why you're remembering it. Yeah.
Mm. Fascinating. I don't think you had shared that. And I mean, it's an interesting approach. I think sometimes I know I get a little stuck in a draft where, the scaffolding's there and I'm trying and trying and trying to make it work, and I'll eventually, give up and say, okay, well, how can I enter it in another way? And
Mm-hmm.
it's usually easier that way. um, anyway, so I think of your other collections of stories, Zigzagger and The Faith Healer of Olive Avenue, as exquisitely curated. I wouldn't want Zigzagger and Faith Healer to be one massive book, because I think that would be a little overwhelming, and the stories in each are so distinctive and so well ordered, kind of like a perfect album. But I like it that I notice points of connection across those works. We've been chatting about this a little bit. That final story in Faith Healer seems to be looking back at the first in Zigzagger. Both are title stories and both have something in common, an ointment that's meant to cure. I'm wondering, do you see links between your new collection and your other books? And what can you tell us about your forthcoming collection?
Yeah, there are connections. Place is obviously the major one. And I'm trying to think if there might be an echo or two into a street name, maybe a situation. The new collection is called The Consequences.
Mm.
And it's essentially, I want to say that kind of the same framework as Faith Healer, where I'm really trying to give the impression of what a neighborhood is.
Mm.
It's incredibly small, but sometimes people don't know each other, and the assumptions that they make about their own neighbors is a story in itself.
Mm.
And there's a lot to be gained from that. I think the added element I think I mentioned earlier was sort of I'm treating some stories as mirrors of each other. That's been helpful in construction. And then the other part was incorporating a lot more of these new anecdotes that my parents told me
Mm.
when I was caretaking for my dad, that really just spun into different directions, and turned out to be a painful time. Turned out to be actually very generative for me. So it's 10 stories now, and the order's not quite settled yet, but it'll be published by Grey Wolf in fall 2022 or very early winter 2023, which sounds like a long way away, but it's right around the corner.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, looking forward to it, and thank you for sharing all of that. Finally, where can we find your work that's already out? Where can our viewers look for your new book and other work you have published in journals?
I would, Sustol was the one that I mentioned that came out in Freeman's Journal, the California issue. The title story, The Consequences, came out in the Southwest Review. And what else is coming? Actually, nothing's coming. I'm sort of sitting tight right now.
Mm.
I don't have anything circulating. I'm waiting for my editor to help me edit. I think there are 4 of the stories that haven't been published before I, try to send those out maybe next year. So we'll see.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me, Manuel. So appreciate your insights and thoughts about this wonderful story.
It was a pleasure talking to you, Ingrid.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.